The blood on my boots wasn't from the Taliban fighter we'd just dropped. It was crimson, yes, but it was too thick, too dark, and it smelled like wet copper pennies mixed with something ancient and wrong. You see, what they don't tell you about classified operations in the Hindu Kush is that sometimes you find things in those caves that were never supposed to see daylight. Things that make you question whether our deployment briefings covered the right kind of enemy. My name is Marcus Chen, former Green Beret, and I'm about to tell you about Operation Bone Garden, a mission that officially never happened, in a place that doesn't exist on any map, against an enemy that the Pentagon would rather you never heard about. But here's the thing about the truth. It leaves stains that won't wash out, no matter how hard you scrub. Afghanistan, 2002. Fob Rhino, just outside Kandahar. Our A-team had been running direct action missions for 3 months straight, the kind of operations where you slip in after midnight, do your business, and slip out before the sun comes up to fry you like an egg on the desert floor. Picture this. 12 men, beards down to our chest plates, eyes that had seen too much, and enough firepower to level a small village. We were ghosts in multicam, moving through valleys that Alexander the Great once marched, hunting high-value targets in a landscape that seemed carved from the bones of dead empires. The locals called our AO, Area of Operations, Kafir Kala, the Fortress of Unbelievers. Not exactly a warm welcome mat. Our team sergeant, Rodriguez, had this ritual. Every morning at 0500, he'd brew coffee so strong it could strip paint, and he'd read us intelligence reports in that gravelly voice of his while we cleaned our weapons. "Gentlemen," he'd say, tapping the map with a finger that was missing its tip from an IED blast in Iraq. "Today, we're hunting ghosts in a graveyard. The mountains there? Christ, you've never felt isolation like that. Peaks that scraped the belly of heaven, valleys so deep they stayed black even at noon, and a silence that pressed against your eardrums like water pressure. At night, the cold would seep through your sleeping bag and settle in your bones. But it wasn't the cold that kept us awake. It was the sounds. Keller, our communications specialist, swore he could hear voices in the static between radio checks. Whispered conversations in languages that didn't sound like Pashto or Dari. Probably just atmospheric interference, our captain would say, but I caught him staring at the radio during those dead hours between midnight and dawn, his hand resting on his sidearm. Our medic, Patterson, started collecting things during that deployment. Small things. A brass button from what looked like a British uniform, blackened with age. A curved knife blade with symbols carved into the metal that none of our interpreters could read. A piece of pottery with handprints pressed into the clay, but the handprints were too large, the fingers too long. History everywhere, Patterson would say, wrapping each find carefully in medical gauze. This place has layers like an onion. There was this one valley we'd been watching for weeks, grid reference 41, RQR 284158, if you care about such things. Intelligence said it was a Taliban supply route, but our observation posts never saw anything moving through it during daylight. At night, though, that's when things got interesting. Through our thermal imaging, we'd catch glimpses of heat signatures moving along the ancient trade paths. But they were wrong, somehow. Too tall, moving with a gait that didn't match human locomotion. Our sniper, Thompson, nicknamed it the Parade, these mysterious figures that seemed to march through the valley in single file, always heading northeast toward the Pakistan border. Command dismissed our reports as environmental anomalies or equipment malfunction. The locals avoided that valley like it was radioactive. Our Afghan interpreter, Hamid, would make excuses whenever we planned operations near Grid 284. "Bad place, Sergeant Chen. he'd say, touching the small metal amulet he wore around his neck. "Very old bad spirits there. Better we go different way." Hamid had guided special operations teams for 2 years without blinking at firefights or IED sweeps, but mentioned that Valley and his hands would start shaking. Then there was the smell. God, the smell. On certain nights, when the wind shifted from the northeast, it would roll down from those peaks like an invisible fog. Sweet and rotten, like overripe fruit mixed with something metallic. It would seep into your gear, your clothes, even your drinking water. Patterson ran tests on everything: water purification tablets, air quality sensors, chemical detection paper. Everything came back normal, but that smell, it would cling to you for days. We'd been in country long enough to know that Afghanistan had its own rules. Ancient rules, places where the normal laws of physics seemed to bend, where your compass would spin like a pinwheel, where photographs would develop with shadows that weren't there when you took the shot. Most of us just learned to work around it, the same way you work around any other occupational hazard. But looking back now, I realize all those little wrongnesses were breadcrumbs. A trail leading us towards something that had been waiting in those mountains for a very, very long time. October 15th, 2002, 03:47 hours. The radio crackled with our patrol leader's voice. "Apache 6, this is Viper 7. We have eyes on the package. Movement confirmed at Grid 284-158. Request permission to investigate." That was Captain Morrison, calling in what would become the last normal radio transmission any of us would make for the next 18 hours. We'd been watching the valley for 6 days from an overwatch position on the northern ridge, waiting for our Taliban supply convoy to show up. Intelligence predicted a weapons cache movement, but so far we'd seen nothing but those weird heat signatures Thompson kept tracking through his scope. But that morning was different. "Chen, get up here," Morrison whispered, not taking his eyes off his binoculars. I low-crawled to his position and he handed me his optics. "Tell me what you see at your 2 o'clock, about 800 meters down." I adjusted the focus and swept the valley floor. At first, nothing. Just the usual boulder field and scattered scrub brush, painted silver by the pre-dawn starlight. Then I saw it. Movement, deliberate, coordinated, but not human. "Sir, I count. Jesus, I count maybe 20 heat signatures, but they're huge, Captain. Whatever those things are, they're massive." I handed back the binoculars, my mouth suddenly dry as sandbox dust. "And they're moving toward that cave system we identified last week." Morrison studied the scene for another 30 seconds, then keyed his radio. "Apache 6, Viper 7. We're moving down to investigate. We'll maintain radio contact every 15 mics." Command's response was immediate. "Negative, Viper 7. Maintain overwatch position. Do not, repeat, do not approach the target area." But Morrison was already gathering his gear. You have to understand. Green Berets don't follow orders that don't make tactical sense, and sitting on a ridge watching unidentified entities move freely through our AO made zero tactical sense. "Gentlemen, we're going hunting. Full battle rattle, night vision up, safety's off. Whatever's down there, we find it, we identify it, we report it." The descent into that valley was like walking into a different world. The temperature dropped 20 degrees as soon as we left the ridgeline, and our night vision started acting up. Flickering, showing double images, occasionally going completely white for no reason. Rodriguez, who'd been using the same PVS-14s for 3 years without a glitch, had to switch to backup optics twice during the approach. The silence was wrong too. Afghanistan is never truly quiet. There's always something. Wind through rocks, distant aircraft, the rustle of small animals. But as we moved deeper into the valley, the ambient noise just stopped. It was like someone had thrown a blanket over the entire world. Keller tried to radio our position at the 15-minute mark. Static. Not the normal static you get from atmospheric interference or terrain masking, but a low rhythmic pulsing that sounded almost like breathing. "Sir, comms are fucked," he whispered to Morrison. "Getting some kind of interference pattern I've never heard before." We'd covered maybe 400 meters when Thompson, our point man, suddenly raised his fist, the universal infantry signal for freeze, danger, close. We dropped into whatever cover we could find and waited. Through my night vision, I could see Thompson's silhouette against the stars, completely motionless, his rifle aimed at something I couldn't see. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Then Thompson began backing toward us, his weapon still trained downrange, moving with the careful precision of a man who knows he's being watched by something that could kill him. When he reached our position, his voice was barely a whisper. "Sir, you need to see this." Morrison and I followed Thompson about 50 meters forward, staying low, until we reached a small rise that gave us a clear view of the cave entrance we'd been observing from the ridge. What we saw there broke something fundamental in my understanding of reality. The cave mouth was easily 30 feet high and twice as wide, much larger than it had appeared from our overwatch position. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the construction. Massive stone blocks, fitted together with surgical precision, formed an archway that was clearly artificial. Not Taliban construction, not Soviet, not anything from this century or the last century or any century I could name. "Chen," Morrison breathed. "Those markings on the stones. Can you make them out?" I adjusted my night vision and focused on the symbols carved deep into the rock face. They weren't Arabic script or any language I recognized. They were geometric patterns, repeating shapes that seemed to twist and shift when you looked at them directly. But there was something else carved there too, something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Handprints. Dozens of them, pressed into the stone like ancient signatures. But these weren't human handprints. They were too large, the fingers too long, with what looked like claw marks extending from each fingertip. And underneath the handprints, carved in rough but unmistakable English letters, was a single word: Nephilim. That's when the ground started shaking. Not an earthquake. I'd been through plenty of those in Afghanistan. This was rhythmic, like footsteps. Heavy footsteps, and they were coming from inside the cave. "Fall back," Morrison whispered. "Fall back right fucking now." But as we turned to retreat, our escape route was blocked. Standing between us and the way we'd come, silhouetted against the star field like something out of a nightmare, was a figure that stood at least 15 feet tall. It wasn't moving. It was just watching us. And that's when the real nightmare began. The thing that stood between us and safety wasn't quite human, but it wasn't quite animal either. Through my night vision, it looked like someone had taken a man and stretched him on a medieval torture rack until everything was wrong. Too tall, limbs too long, proportions that violated every law of human anatomy. Its head was massive, crowned with what looked like ram's horns that curved back from its skull, and its eyes— Christ, its eyes reflected our infrared illuminators like mirrors, throwing back a dull red glow that made my stomach clench with primal terror. It was wearing what appeared to be ancient armor, bronze or copper plates that had been green with verdigris for centuries, strapped over a torso that was easily 4 feet wide. "Don't move," Morrison whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "Don't even breathe hard." For what felt like an eternity, we existed in this three-way standoff. Us crouched behind a boulder, the giant motionless on our escape route. and whatever else was making those heavy footsteps inside the cave. The only sound was our controlled breathing and the distant thump, thump, thump of something massive moving around in the tunnels behind us. Then Rodriguez made a decision that probably saved our lives. He very slowly reached into his cargo pocket and pulled out a small digital camera, one of those rugged military spec units we used for intelligence gathering. Without taking his eyes off the giant, he powered it on and began taking photographs. The camera's LCD screen showed us what our night vision couldn't quite capture. The figure blocking our path wasn't alone. There were others, just outside our field of view, shapes moving with deliberate purpose through the boulder field, forming what looked like a perimeter around our position. We were surrounded. "How many?" Morrison whispered. Rodriguez checked his camera's preview screen. 6, maybe 7. "Jesus Christ, sir, they're all huge." That's when we heard the voice. Not a human voice, something deeper, older, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a deep well. It spoke a single word in what sounded like Hebrew or Aramaic, and immediately all the giant figures stopped moving. Even the footsteps from inside the cave fell silent. "Keller," Morrison whispered, "please tell me you're recording this." Our communications specialist nodded, tapping his encrypted digital recorder. But when he checked the playback, all we could hear was that same rhythmic static, like breathing, but amplified 1,000 times. Whatever language those things spoke, our equipment couldn't capture it properly. The giant nearest to us turned its head toward the cave entrance and spoke again, a longer string of those grinding, ancient words. The response came from deep inside the tunnels, echoing off stone walls that must have stretched for miles underground. It was like listening to a conversation between mountains. "Sir," Thompson whispered, "we need to document this. Nobody's going to believe us without proof." Morrison nodded and made a series of hand signals. "Document everything. Stay hidden. Prepare to move on my command." So we did what Special Forces operators do when faced with the impossible. We treated it like just another mission and gathered intelligence. Rodriguez continued photographing while Keller tried to get clear audio recordings. Patterson, our medic, was sketching in his notebook. Rough diagrams of the cave entrance, the stone construction, and the proportions of the figures surrounding us. Thompson kept watch through his rifle scope, calling out positions and movements in barely audible whispers. "Giant 1 is moving toward the cave. Giant 3 is, fuck me, it's looking right at us." I risked a glance over our boulder concealment. The creature Thompson called Giant 3 had turned its massive head in our direction, and those mirror-bright eyes seemed to be staring directly into my soul. But after a few seconds it looked away, apparently dismissing us as unimportant. That's when we discovered what was inside the cave. The largest of the giants, the one who seemed to be their leader, walked into the tunnel entrance and began speaking in that grinding, ancient voice. But this time, he was answered by multiple voices from deep underground. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all speaking in unison like some kind of chant or prayer. "Rodriguez," Morrison whispered, "can you get a shot of what's inside that cave?" Rodriguez adjusted his camera's settings for low-light photography and aimed it toward the tunnel entrance. The flash was barely visible to us, but the giants noticed immediately. Every one of them turned toward our position simultaneously, their reflective eyes creating a constellation of red dots in our night vision. "Move," Morrison hissed. "Move right fucking now." We belly-crawled backward as fast as we could while staying below the sight line of the boulder field. But as we moved, Rodriguez kept his camera running, and what he captured in those last few seconds would haunt my dreams for the next 20 years. The cave entrance was filled with them. Giants, all similar in size and shape to the ones outside, but these were different, older. Some were wearing what looked like ancient Persian armor, others Roman military gear, still others dressed in the style of medieval crusaders. And scattered among them, like trophies, were more recent additions to their collection. Soviet uniforms from the 1980s, British military gear from the Victorian era, and yes, modern American equipment. Helmets, body armor, weapons, all arranged in neat piles like offerings at some ungodly altar. At the back of the cave, barely visible in the camera's digital display, was something that made my blood freeze. A pile of human skulls and bones, arranged in precise geometric patterns around what appeared to be a stone altar. But these weren't normal human remains. Every skull was fractured, crushed, as if something with immense strength had squeezed them like eggshells. "Sir," Patterson whispered, studying the camera's LCD screen. "Those aren't combat casualties. Look at the fracture patterns on those bones. Whatever killed those people did it with its bare hands." As we continued our withdrawal, the chanting from inside the cave grew louder and more rhythmic. It was hypnotic, almost musical, but underneath the melody was something that triggered every survival instinct we possessed. It was the sound of predators calling to their prey. We'd retreated maybe 200 meters when Thompson spotted something that changed everything. "Sir, there's an entrance to the cave system about 50 meters to our east, smaller than the main cave, but I can see artificial light coming from inside." Artificial light. Electric light, which meant someone with modern equipment was down there. Someone human. "Could be prisoners," Morrison said. "Could be other coalition forces. Could be—" His speculation was cut off by the unmistakable sound of American voices echoing from the smaller cave entrance. Voices speaking English, with American accents calling for help. But something about those voices was wrong. They were too clear, too perfectly enunciated, like actors reading lines from a script. "Hello? Is someone there, please? We're Americans. We need help." The voice carried clearly across the valley, bouncing off the stone walls with unnatural clarity. "My name is Sergeant Michael Sullivan, United States Army. We've been trapped down here for days." Rodriguez checked his records. "Sir, Sergeant Michael Sullivan, 10th Mountain Division, was killed in action 3 months ago. I remember the after-action report." The voices continued calling from the cave. More names, more units, all perfectly clear American English asking for rescue. But as Rodriguez continued checking his database, we realized that every name they called out belonged to someone who was already dead. KIA reports going back months, even years. "It's bait," Morrison realized. "They're using the voices of dead soldiers to lure in rescue teams." And that's when we understood the true horror of what we'd stumbled into. This wasn't just some unknown species living in the mountains of Afghanistan. This was a trap. A sophisticated, intelligent trap that had been claiming victims for decades, maybe centuries. And we'd walked right into it. The chanting from the main cave suddenly stopped. The fake American voices fell silent. And in that terrible quiet, we heard something that made our blood run cold. The sound of massive feet moving through the cave system, heading toward the smaller entrance. Heading toward the source of those false distress calls. They were coming for us. "Back to the ridge. Now." Morrison's voice cut through our panic like a knife blade. "We extract, we report, we let someone else figure out what the hell this is." But as we began our withdrawal up the valley wall, the mountain itself seemed to turn against us. The path we'd taken down, a route we'd memorized and rehearsed, was no longer there. Where there had been a navigable slope just hours before, now there was only a sheer rock face that rose straight up into the darkness. "Sir," Thompson called out, his voice tight with controlled fear. "The terrain's changed. This isn't the same valley we entered." I looked at my GPS. Dead. Compass spinning like a roulette wheel. Even the stars looked wrong. Constellations I'd used for navigation since basic training were in positions that defied everything I knew about astronomy. We were trapped in a place that had somehow divorced itself from the normal laws of geography and physics. "Keller, radio check. Get us an extraction." Keller tried every frequency we had. Emergency bands, tactical nets, even civilian aviation channels. Nothing but that rhythmic static that sounded like breathing amplified through a cathedral organ. "Sir, it's like we're in a bubble. No signals in, no signals out." Behind us, from the direction of the caves, came a sound that I can only describe as organized movement. Not the random noise of animals or the chaotic shuffle of a crowd, but the deliberate, coordinated steps of a military formation. They were coming for us, and they were taking their time about it. "Defensive positions," Morrison ordered. "We hold here until dawn, then reassess our situation." We found a cluster of boulders that offered decent cover and fields of fire down the valley. Rodriguez distributed ammunition while Patterson checked our medical supplies. Thompson and I established overlapping sectors of observation. Standard infantry procedures, applied to a completely non-standard situation. "Sir," Patterson said, reviewing the photos on Rodriguez's camera, "I need to show you something." He'd been studying the images of the bone pile inside the main cave, and what he'd discovered made my stomach turn. Those skulls weren't just randomly arranged, they were sorted by time period and nationality. Soviet skulls from the 1980s in one pile, British colonial-era remains in another, and what looked like much older specimens arranged in increasingly ancient groupings. "It's like a museum," Patterson whispered. "A trophy collection spanning centuries, maybe millennia." But the most disturbing discovery was a small pile of very recent remains. American skulls, still bearing traces of modern dental work and dog tag impressions. "Sir, these people died recently, within the last few months. And look at this." He pointed to one of the clearest photographs. Carved into the stone wall above the bone piles, in perfect English, were names and dates. American names, recent dates, including Sergeant Michael Sullivan, whose voice we'd heard calling for help from the smaller cave. "They're not just killing people," Morrison realized. "They're studying us, learning from us, documenting us." That's when the first giant crested the ridge above our position. In full darkness, it was even more terrifying than it had been in the valley. 15 feet of ancient muscle and bone, moving with the fluid grace of a trained warrior despite its massive size. It carried what looked like a bronze sword that was easily 6 feet long and inscribed with the same geometric symbols we'd seen on the cave entrance. "Contact front," Thompson whispered, settling his crosshair center mass on the creature's torso. "Range 400 meters and closing." More giants appeared along the ridgeline. Not just the 6 or 7 we'd seen earlier, but dozens of them, spread out in a perfect envelopment formation that would have impressed any infantry school instructor. They were using legitimate military tactics, adapted for their size and capabilities. "How do they know how to do that?" Keller whispered. The answer came in the form of one of the giants raising what was unmistakably a Soviet-era radio to its mouth. Static filled our earpieces, followed by a voice speaking perfect English with a distinctly American accent. "Attention, United States military personnel. You are surrounded. Surrender your weapons, and you will not be harmed." It was Sergeant Sullivan's voice. Clear, calm, professional. exactly how a trained soldier would conduct surrender negotiations, but Sergeant Sullivan had been dead for 3 months. "They're using our own procedures against us," Morrison breathed. "They've been studying captured personnel, learning our tactics, our language, our protocols." The voice continued. "You have 60 seconds to comply. Lay down your weapons and move to the center of your position with your hands visible." It was word for word from the standard detainee operations manual. Morrison keyed his radio, knowing it wouldn't transmit but hoping the giants would hear him on their captured equipment. "This is Captain John Morrison, United States Army Special Forces. We are conducting authorized military operations in this area. Identify yourself." The response came immediately, but this time it wasn't in Sullivan's voice. It was Morrison's own voice, speaking back to him from the radio. "This is Captain John Morrison, United States Army Special Forces. We are conducting authorized military operations in this area. Identify yourself." Perfect mimicry, perfect inflection. They'd learned his speech patterns from less than 30 seconds of radio transmission. Whatever these things were, they possessed intelligence far beyond anything we'd been briefed to expect. "Open fire on my command," Morrison whispered. "Aimed shots, center mass, make every round count." But before he could give the command, the giants did something that changed the entire tactical situation. They began speaking in unison, all of them at once, in that grinding ancient language we'd heard at the cave. And as their voices rose and fell in rhythmic chanting, our equipment started failing. Night vision flickered and died. Weapon optics went dark. Even our mechanical compass stopped working. The needle just spun lazily in its housing like it had lost all sense of magnetic north. We were being systematically stripped of our technological advantages. "Switch to iron sights," Morrison ordered. "Basic infantry tactics. Treat them like any other enemy formation." Thompson fired first. A clean shot that should have dropped any human target. The round struck the nearest giant, center mass, and we clearly heard the impact of copper-jacketed lead on flesh, but the creature didn't even flinch. It looked down at its chest, brushed at the impact point like someone had thrown a pebble at it, then continued advancing. "Sir, small arms fire is ineffective," Thompson reported, his voice steady despite the impossibility of what he'd just witnessed. "Recommend we—" He never finished the sentence. The giant he'd shot reached down, picked up a boulder the size of a washing machine, and hurled it at our position with casual, terrifying accuracy. We scattered just as the boulder smashed into the rocks where we'd been taking cover, sending stone fragments flying like shrapnel. Rodriguez took a piece of granite in the shoulder and went down hard. Patterson immediately moved to treat him while the rest of us tried to establish a new defensive line. But there was nowhere to go. The giants had us completely surrounded now, moving in a slowly tightening circle that would crush us in minutes, and our weapons were useless against them. "Fall back to the cave," Morrison ordered. "If we can't go over them, we go through them." It was insane, retreating toward the very place these things had come from. But sometimes insane is all you have left. We grabbed Rodriguez, who was conscious but bleeding heavily, and began a fighting withdrawal toward the smaller cave entrance where we'd heard the fake distress calls. The giants let us go. They actually stepped aside and allowed us to retreat, forming a corridor that funneled us directly toward the cave mouth. It was another trap, obviously, but it was the only option we had. As we approached the cave entrance, the fake American voices started up again. "Thank God you found us. We're down here, we're hurt, we need immediate medical attention." But now we could see where the voices were coming from. Just inside the cave entrance, scattered around what looked like a small underground chamber, were pieces of American military equipment. Radios, recording devices, even a laptop computer. all of it connected by cables to what appeared to be some kind of ancient stone mechanism covered in those same geometric symbols. They'd built a machine that could perfectly replicate human voices, using our own technology combined with something far older and more sinister. "They've been doing this for years," Patterson whispered, examining the setup while he continued treating Rodriguez's wound. "Decades, maybe, luring in rescue teams, studying them, learning from them." And that's when we realized the true scope of what we were facing. This wasn't just a single group of creatures living in one cave. This was an organized, intelligent operation that had been systematically hunting and studying human military personnel for generations. Every technique we used, every tactic we employed, every piece of equipment we carried, they'd seen it all before, learned from it, and found ways to turn it against us. The giants were closing in on the cave entrance now, moving with the patient confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. And somewhere in the darkness behind us, we could hear those ancient voices chanting again, calling to something even deeper in the mountain. We were about to meet the thing they'd been feeding all these years. "Sir," Rodriguez's voice was getting weaker, but his eyes were still sharp with the clarity that comes when you know you're about to die. "That stone mechanism. I think I know how it works." He'd been studying the ancient symbols while Patterson worked on his shoulder wound, and what he'd discovered might be our only chance at survival. "Talk to me, Rodriguez." "It's not just mimicking our voices, Captain. It's recording them, storing them in that stone matrix somehow." He gestured weakly toward the artifact that the giants had connected to our captured equipment. "Every soldier who's died down here, every word they spoke before they were killed, it's all in there." Morrison understood immediately. "You're saying that thing contains the voices of every American who's been captured by these things?" "Yes, sir. And if I'm right about how it works..." Rodriguez tried to sit up, winced, then continued. "If I'm right, we can use it to call for backup. Real backup." The giants were at the cave entrance now, their massive forms blocking out the starlight. In the green glow of our failing night vision, they looked like something out of a medieval nightmare. Ancient warriors from an age when gods walked the earth and men cowered in caves. But Rodriguez was talking about something that might turn our situation around. "The machine doesn't just store voices," he explained rapidly. "It amplifies them, projects them across distances. That's how they've been luring people into these mountains for years, using the voices of the dead to call to the living." His breathing was getting shallow, but his mind was razor sharp. "Sir, I can reverse the process. Use it to broadcast a real distress signal." "Rodriguez, that thing is connected to God knows what. We don't know what turning it on might..." "Captain." Rodriguez's voice cut through Morrison's objections with quiet authority. "I'm not walking out of these mountains. We all know that. But maybe you can." He looked at the stone mechanism, then back at Morrison. "I can jury-rig this thing to broadcast on emergency frequencies. Military satellites will pick up the signal, triangulate our position, send in a full rescue operation." The first giant stepped into the cave. Up close, it was even more massive than we'd realized. Its head scraped the ceiling, and its bronze armor reflected our weapon lights like mirrors. It moved with careful deliberation, like something that had learned patience over centuries of hunting. "Do it," Morrison ordered. Rodriguez pulled himself over to the stone mechanism and began working, with the captured equipment. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd spent years maintaining communications gear in the field. Blood from his shoulder wound dripped onto the ancient symbols, and where it touched the stone, the geometric patterns began to glow with a soft, pulsing light. "Jesus," Patterson whispered. "It's responding to him." "Not to me," Rodriguez corrected, his voice growing weaker. "To us, to human blood. That's how it works. It needs life force to function." He looked up at Morrison with eyes that held no fear, only determination. "Sir, this thing is going to take everything I've got to power it, but it'll work. One transmission, full power, broad spectrum, everyone from here to CENTCOM will hear it." The giant had stopped moving and was watching Rodriguez work with what seemed like curiosity. Other giants were gathering at the cave entrance, but they weren't advancing. It was as if they recognized what was happening and wanted to observe the process. Rodriguez, "Sir, with respect, shut up and let me work." Rodriguez's smile was weak but genuine. "I've got maybe 2 minutes before I bleed out completely. Let me make them count." He connected the final cable, and the stone mechanism erupted in brilliant light. The geometric symbols flared like tiny stars, and the ancient artifact began humming with power that seemed to come from the earth itself. The giants stepped back, their mirror-bright eyes reflecting the sudden illumination. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," Rodriguez spoke into the captured radio, his voice clear and strong despite his wounds. "This is Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, U.S. Army Special Forces, transmitting emergency beacon from grid reference 41, RQR 284158. We have encountered unknown hostile forces. Repeat, unknown hostile forces. Request immediate air support and extraction." The transmission went out with power that lit up the entire cave system, through the stone walls, through the mountain itself, carried by whatever ancient technology these giants had been using for centuries. Every satellite over Central Asia would have heard that signal. Rodriguez collapsed backward, the radio falling from his hands, but he was still smiling. "Package delivered, Captain. Help is on the way. The giants didn't try to stop us as we retreated deeper into the cave system. They'd gotten what they wanted. Another human voice for their collection, another trophy for their ancient museum. But they'd also given us something they didn't intend: time. Time for help to arrive. Time for someone to come looking for us. Time for the world to learn that something impossible was living in these mountains." As Rodriguez's breathing stopped, the stone mechanism went dark, but somewhere in the distance we could hear the sound of helicopters approaching, fast, low, and heavily armed. The giants had finally met something bigger than they were. I still carry Rodriguez's dog, Tags. Blood-stained metal that never quite cleaned up, no matter how much I scrubbed them. They pulled the rest of us out 6 hours later, but the official report classified everything as equipment malfunction and combat stress reaction. No giants, no ancient caves, no stone machines that could steal the voices of the dead. But I know what I saw, and if you're hiking alone in the mountains and hear someone calling your name in a voice you recognize, don't answer. Not yet. Subscribe before the next classified story finds its way to your screen. And tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from and what time is it there? Let's see how far this truth has spread